Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about President Trump's controversial summit with Russia's Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. Let's listen in.
In the United Kingdom, has occupied portions of Georgia, continues to violate the INF Treaty, has reportedly hacked U.S. utilities. The list goes on, and you know the list. In the face of these hostilities, in the summit's aftermath, we saw an American president who appeared submissive and deferential. We've heard that some agreements were reached, but as of yet have little idea what those might be, even though the president has already extended an invitation to Putin to come to Washington to discuss the implementation, quote, quote, of these undefined agreements. The president also recently met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, one of the most ruthless leaders on the planet, who has continued to develop nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that could hit the United States, has executed his half-brother with poison in Malaysia, and reportedly killed his uncle back home, has essentially murdered an American college student, and has enslaved millions of his own people. 1 in 10 North Koreans are living in slavery today, and 1 in 5 children are stunted due to malnutrition. In the face of these realities, the president has called him very talented and that he loves his people. Really? At the recent NATO Summit, the president not only pushed NATO member countries to dedicate more of their budgets to defense, a goal we all share. He went on to berate them, question the very premise of NATO, and in my opinion, use false information to turn public opinion in the United States against the alliance. He even went so far as to cast doubt on the United States' willingness to enforce Article 5 of the NATO treaty. We want to know if this is real or just another off-the-cuff statement. And the confronting of our partners goes beyond traditional security and extends to the economic space as well. I know you're aware of my strong feelings about the administration's abuse of its authorities in using Section 232 to implement tariffs in the name of national security. So far, we have zero clarity from the administration as to what the end game is on the Trump-Pence tariffs, which in reality are a massive tax increase on American consumers and businesses. And now the administration appears ready to offer welfare to farmers who would rather have trade than aid. As you know, senators have gone to the White House in groups to discuss these actions, and not a single person that I'm aware of has left those meetings with the sense that there's a coherent strategy driving these policies. The administration tells us, don't worry, be patient, there's a strategy here, but from where we sit, it appears that in a ready, fire, aim fashion, the White House is waking up every morning and making it up as they go. This is the first in a series of hearings we will hold in coming weeks dealing with the troubling dynamic I've described, one in which we are antagonizing our friends and placating those who clearly wish us ill. This series will deal specifically with Russia as perhaps the most troubling example of this emerging reality. I hope that in your position you will do all in your power to provide us with the answers we need today, and as we move forward in our future hearings. I look forward to your testimony, and I want to thank you again for being with us and for the many outstanding people you're bringing on to the State Department to work with you. With that, I'll turn to Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying I applaud you for making this the first of a series of rigorous oversight hearings on Russia. The committee's gone for about a year without a full committee hearing on either Russia or North Korea, so I appreciate your leadership in this regard. And now it seems to have taken a three-ring circus of a debacle of a meeting with President Putin, a walk back of whether the president trusts his own intelligence officials, the suggestion that it might be even okay for a U.S. diplomat to be interrogated by Russian intelligence, and a reality TV summit that was little more than a photo op with a brutal dictator to merit one hearing with the Secretary of State. Having said that, Mr. Secretary, welcome and thank you for your service to our country. The members of this committee are strongly supportive of strategic, well-crafted diplomacy to advance America's foreign policy interests. Unfortunately, all we've come to expect is a saber-rattling president who embraces and provides legitimacies to some of the world's most notorious bad actors, and who denigrates our closest allies whose sons and daughters have gone to war alongside Americans. We've not seen any substantive deals or strategies that put Americans or American national security first. We've seen our president look weak as he stands beside our adversaries and intends to roll out the red carpet at the White House. I hear that's postponed till January, but nonetheless, to invite Putin to the White House, a thug who is actively trying to undermine our elections. Well, Mr. Secretary, we in this body are taking heed of our intelligence and law enforcement officials and working to protect our country from the flashing red lights of ongoing Russian aggression. Senator Graham and I and others plan to introduce legislation in the coming days to ensure we have the toughest tools to go after Russian bad actors. As of this moment, we find ourselves in an unimaginable situation. The American people, elected officials in this body, and members of the president's own cabinet have heard more about the meeting in Helsinki from Putin and his associates than from our president. We know that the Kremlin state-run media operations have a dubious commitment to the truth, but we don't know what the truth is because nobody else was in the room where it happened. The American people expect, and I believe they deserve to know, what happened. I also have serious questions about the summit in Singapore that took place nearly 2 months ago. In that time, we have yet to hear or see anything that provides us with real confidence that North Korea, as the president gloated, quote, no longer poses a threat to the United States, or that we have a coherent strategy to achieve a verifiable denuclearization agreement. We've only seen a vague agreement of promises to make more promises, but of weaker commitments than North Korea has previously made. The United States and North Korea seem to remain far apart on even basic issues such as the definition of denuclearization. In fact, over the past 18 months under this administration's watch, North Korea has perfected its intercontinental ballistic missiles and tested its largest nuclear detonation rather than any verifiable steps to dismantle their program. It seems Kim Jong-un got everything he wanted in Singapore, including international recognition and the suspension of U.S. military exercises. Now, this week's reports of dismantlement at a launching station may be good news, but it may simply be a signal that North Korea has completed all the testing it needs to. Frankly, the Singapore agreement seems more the art of concessions than the art of the deal, and we are weaker for it. Last week, Russia and China blocked a U.S. request to impose penalties on sanctions violations, calling our maximum pressure posture into question. As you know, I've introduced bipartisan oversight legislation along with Senator Gardner to provide the sort of support and guidance that this diplomatic effort needs and exercise the oversight responsibility Congress owes to the American people. Goals that you previously laid out before this committee are incorporated. Finally, let me raise one more deeply alarming issue that broke this week. I understand that despite its ability to stop this ridiculous notion, the State Department is about to allow internet posting of do-it-yourself 3D printable firearm blueprints. Why on earth would the Trump administration make it easier for terrorists and gunmen to produce undetectable plastic guns? I remain deeply concerned by the administration's incoherent and contradictory views. We need comprehensive strategies across the world because the result of the lack thereof is chaos and confusion, or even worse. I recognize the president considers himself to be a masterful deal maker and a very stable genius. But we need to call the president's statements out for what they are. At this point, I find them to be misleading and untruthful. So I look forward to your testimony to find out what the truth really is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, we welcome you again. And if you could summarize your comments. If you have any written materials you'd like to enter the record, we will do so. And with that, we look forward to your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Menendez, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. During my confirmation hearing, you asked me to work on a host of world problems. And for 12 weeks, I've been doing just that. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about each of those today. The last few weeks, I've engaged in 3 areas of particular interest to this committee: North Korea, NATO, and Russia. On the subject of Russia, I want to bring something to your attention right off the bat today. Today, the Trump administration is releasing what we're calling the Crimea Declaration. I won't read the whole thing. I will submit it for the record. It's been publicly released as well. But one part reads as follows, quote, "The United States calls on Russia to respect the principles to which it has long claimed to adhere and to end its occupation of Crimea," end of quote. I want to assure this committee that the United States does not and will not recognize the Kremlin's purported annexation of Crimea. We stand together with allies, partners, and the international community in our commitment to Ukraine and its territorial integrity. There will be no relief of Crimea-related sanctions until Russia returns control of the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine. This Crimea Declaration formalizes United States policy of non-recognition. There's another indicator of diplomatic progress I want to mention. This morning, Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was imprisoned in Turkey for nearly 2 years, has been let out of jail at Bucha. He's still under house arrest, so our work is not done. But it's welcome progress, one that many of you have been engaged in, something the State Department has been working on diligently as well. We will continue to work for the speedy return of all Americans unjustly held captive abroad. President Trump will never forget about our own. Our diplomacy on these issues is advancing the goals of President Trump's national security strategy, which laid down guiding principles for American foreign policy in December. In late April, I started executing on the strategy as Secretary of State, and today, on July 1st, here we are, and I want to present you some progress. The national security strategy established protecting the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life as the pillars of our national security. On July 17th, President Trump stated his firm conviction that diplomacy and engagement are preferable to conflict and hostility. These principles have guided our actions on North Korea. President Trump's diplomacy de-escalated a situation in which the prospect for conflict was rising daily. Americans are safer because of his actions. As far as the Trump administration's goals on North Korea are concerned, nothing's changed. Our objective remains the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea as agreed to by Chairman Kim Jong-un. As a follow-up to President's successful summit with Chairman Kim, on July 5th, I traveled to North Korea to make progress on the commitments that were made in Singapore. We're engaged in patient diplomacy, but we will not let this drag out to no end. I emphasize this position in the productive discussions I had with Vice Chairman Kim Young-chol. President Trump remains upbeat about the prospects for North Korean denuclearization. Progress is happening. We need Chairman Kim Jong-un to follow through on its commitments that he made in Singapore. Until North Korea eliminates its weapons of mass destruction, our sanctions and those at the United Nations will remain in effect. Multiple UN Security Council resolutions require North Korea to eliminate all of its weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs. Those resolutions were passed unanimously, and they remain binding. We absolutely need every single nation to maintain the enforcement of those sanctions to which every nation is committed. The path ahead is not easy, but our hopes for a safer world and a brighter future for North Korea endure. The national security strategy also calls for peace through strength. President Trump's engagement on NATO has resulted in greater burden sharing that will strengthen the entire alliance against myriad conventional and unconventional threats. Allies have spent more than $40 billion in increased defense spending since 2016, and there will be hundreds of billions of dollars more in the years ahead. Last year's $14.4 billion in new spending was a 5.1% increase. It was the largest in a generation. 8 allies will meet the 2% this year. 18 are on track to do so by 24. The Trump administration is demanding that every country make its own commitment. NATO will remain an indispensable pillar of American national security. We know weakness provokes our enemies, but strength and cohesion protect us. The more every NATO member contributes, the better the alliance can fulfill its mission of deterring threats to each of our nations. This is the increased commitment that the President wants. From the outset of this administration, the National Defense Strategy and the Russia Integrated Strategy, our approach has been the same: to steadily raise the cost of aggression until Vladimir Putin chooses a less confrontational foreign policy while keeping the door open for dialogue in our national interest. Between our two nations, the United States and Russia possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. President Trump believes that two great nuclear powers should not have a contentious relationship. This is not just in our interest, but in the interest of the whole world. He strongly believes that now is the time for direct communication in our relationship in order to make clear to President Putin that there is the possibility, however remote it might be, to reverse the negative course of our relationship. Otherwise, the administration will continue imposing tough actions against Russia in response to its malign activities. We can't make progress on issues of mutual concern unless we're talking about them. I've heard many of you on this panel say that for years and years. I'm referring to key issues like stopping terrorism, obtaining peace in Ukraine, stopping the civil war in Syria and delivering humanitarian assistance, ensuring security for Israel, and shutting down all of Iran's malign activity. And on the subject of Iran, President Trump has said that Iran is not the same country it was 5 months ago. That's because our campaign of financial pressure, our withdrawal from the nuclear deal, and our full-throated support for the Iranian people, which I articulated in a speech this past Sunday, are having an impact. In Helsinki, we sought to explore whether Russia was interested in improving our relationship, but made clear that the ball is in Russia's court. We defended America's fundamental strategic interests in Syria and Ukraine, and I personally made clear to the Russians that there will be severe consequences for interference in our democratic processes. I would also add that President Trump is well aware of the challenges that Russia poses to the United States and our partners and allies. He's taken a staggering number of actions to protect our interests. As just a few pieces of proof, I'd like to cite the following: 213 sanctions on Russian entities and individuals in the Trump administration, 60 Russian spies expelled from the United States of America, and the closure of Russia's consulate in Seattle in response to Russia's chemical weapons use in the United Kingdom, the closure of Russia's consulate in San Francisco, cutting U.S. diplomatic staffing by Russia by almost 70%. 150 military exercises have been led or participated in Europe this year alone. More than $11 billion have been put forward for the European Defense Initiative. We made defensive weapons available to Ukraine and to Georgia. And just last week, the Department of Defense, this is after Helsinki, added an additional $200 million in security cooperation funds to Ukraine. None of this happened for the 8 years that preceded President Trump. It's not enough for you. There's a long list. I'm happy to go through them. I'm guessing sometime today I'll get that opportunity. I look forward to it. Finally, I want you to know President Trump has stated that he accepts our intelligence community's conclusion that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. He has a complete and proper understanding of what happened. I know. I briefed him on it for over a year. This is perfectly clear to me personally. I am also certain he deeply respects the difficult and dangerous work that our patriots in the intelligence community do every single day, and I know that he feels the same way about the amazing people that work at the United States Department of State. Thank you, Chairman Corker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The Secretary of Staff has asked that we absolutely stay to the 7-minute deal, so if we could not ask 5-part questions and end at 6:58, if you could give the respondent time to answer within the 7 minutes too, I'd appreciate it. With that, I'll defer to Senator Menendez. I'll withhold my time for interjections along the way. Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, when the President meets alone with President Putin, it allows the Kremlin-sponsored state media and the Russian Ministry of Defense to provide more information, at least from their perspective, not only to the American people, but sometimes it seems to the members of the President's own cabinet. So I'd like to ask you some questions to get to understand what actually happened. Has the President told you what he and President Putin discussed in their 2-hour closed-door meeting in Helsinki? You could put your microphone on.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. The presidents have a prerogative to choose who's in meetings or not. I'm confident you've had private one-on-one meetings in your life as well. You've chosen that setting as the most efficient way to...
I just asked you a simple question. Did you... You can't eat up my 7 minutes, Mr. Secretary. Did he tell you whether or not what happened in those 2 hours?
Yes, Senator. The predicate of your question implied some notion that there was something improper about having a one-on-one meeting. I completely disagree with the premise of your question.
I didn't ask you a predicate. I asked you a simple question. I hope we're going to get through it. Did he tell you what transpired in the 2-hour meeting?
I've had a number of conversations with President Trump about what transpired in the meeting. I was also present when he and President Putin both gave us a sense of what they discussed in the meeting that followed immediately after.
Did you have...
I've also had the chance to speak with Sergei Lavrov twice about the Russian view on what takes place. I think I have a pretty complete understanding of what took place in that meeting.
Did you speak to the translator who was at that meeting?
No, I haven't.
Have you seen any of her notes?
Senator, I've been in lots of meetings. I've had lots of note takers and lots of translators. I've never relied on the work that they did for me to understand what took place in that meeting, and it does not need to be done here and won't be.
Did the President discuss relaxing U.S. sanctions on Russia, including CAATSA sanctions?
Senator, the U.S. policy with respect to sanctions remains completely unchanged.
So the President did not, is what you're telling me, that I ask a very specific question.
Yes,
did
Senator,
the President tell you that he discussed relaxing Russia's sanctions or not? Yes or no?
Senator, presidents are entitled to have private meetings. I'm telling you what U.S. policy is. I came here today.
No, but you told me that he had a conversation with you in which he told you what transpired. I think the nation and so all of us who are policy makers deserve to know so that we can fashion policy accordingly. Did he tell Putin that our release or ultimately relax sanctions?
Senator, what you need to conduct your role, your appropriate role, I will provide you today. That is United States policy with respect to the issues you request. You asked me about U.S. policy with respect to sanctions, and I can confirm to you that no commitment has been made to change those policies in any way.
Did the President at this meeting call upon President Putin to withdraw from Crimea and eastern Ukraine?
Senator, I began my statement today with the United States government's policy.
I understand the declaration. I welcome it. I'm glad that it seems like we had to do a lot of effort to get there. But the question is, when he had a chance, did he confront Putin and say, we don't recognize your annexation of Crimea, we don't recognize your continuing hostilities in eastern Ukraine, and there's consequences for that?
Senator, the President was very clear with Vladimir Putin about U.S. positions. They're the U.S. positions that are the Trump administration's positions, and he spoke about them very firmly and clearly when he met with Vladimir Putin.
And he told you that?
Senator, I'm telling you what he had a conversation with Vladimir Putin about, and I'm telling you what U.S. policy is today. I understand, Senator, I understand the game that you're playing.
No, you know, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, I don't appreciate you characterizing my questions. My questions is to get to the truth. We don't know what the truth is. And the only way that we will know what the truth is, what transpired in those 2 hours, in a highly amazing period of time to spend alone, one-on-one, is by understanding at least that if you were briefed by the President, what he told you. I don't think that's unfair to know, to understand what policy is. Let me ask you this. Did the President say they were going to change our force structure in Syria?
Senator, presidents are permitted to have conversations with their cabinet members that aren't repeated in public. I owe the President the capacity for him to have conversations with him, provide him the best foreign policy advice that I can. It's what I was
Let me ask you this, Mr. Secretary. Here's something you can answer for me, because you're not going to answer any of the questions that would get us to the truth. As CIA director, you stated in an interview with the BBC that you fully expect Russia to continue its attacks on our democracy by attempting to interfere in our midterm elections as we speak. In his conversation with Putin, I hope the President laid out the consequences of interference in the 2018 election, but I know you can't tell me that, so you're not
Actually, I can't tell you
do you
that,
want to share that one with me?
I can't. No, I can't.
That one you want to share with me?
No, Senator, I can tell you that because the President has disclosed that.
Okay.
The President disclosed what he said to Vladimir Putin about Russian interference in our elections, and he said that he is confident that as a result of that conversation, Vladimir understands that it won't be tolerated.
I wish he had said that in public in Helsinki. Let me ask you this. Senator Graham and I and others are working on a new bill to hold Russia accountable. Given that you assert the administration is tough on Russia, will you commit to working with us on a new Russia sanctions bill?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. North Korea. When you last appeared, I asked you a series of critical questions about what's our policy in North Korea, and to your credit, I must say that I largely agreed with what our goals are. Now I want to ask you, since we haven't heard anything, not a classified briefing, not anything as it relates to North Korea, did North Korea agree with our definition of denuclearization, meaning the dismantlement, removal of all nuclear weapons, facilities, technology, and material from North Korea?
I think I can answer your question, but let me begin by saying I'm engaged in a complex negotiation with the North Koreans, and so I don't intend in this public setting to share the details of every conversation that took place in those. But I will attempt to answer your questions without disclosing the contents of the negotiation. I am very confident that the North Koreans understand our definition of denuclearization, a very broad one that goes from infrastructure and nuclear warheads, through chemical, biological weapons.
We understand that because you laid it for the record. Have they agreed with you that that is?
I believe they thoroughly understand that, and they
understand it, but they didn't agree. Did they agree to end the production and enrichment of uranium and plutonium for military programs?
Senator, I would welcome the chance to respond to your questions. If you'd let me finish, it would be most
simple yes or no.
I think it'd be most illuminating for the folks watching.
It's a simple yes or no.
Could you repeat the question, please, Senator? It was the previous question I didn't have the chance to answer.
Surely. Did North Korea agree to end the production and enrichment of uranium and plutonium for military programs?
They've agreed to denuclearize fully. Yes, Senator.
Okay. We don't have.
Yes, it certainly includes the full.
I would love for you to come to a classified setting and tell all members what exactly transpired, because we don't know.
Thank you, Senator Risch.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for doing this job. The President made a wise decision appointing you as Secretary of State, and you're acquitting yourself very well here today, and we appreciate that. You've always been straightforward with us, and I appreciate that. I know many of my colleagues, not all, but many of my colleagues fully appreciate that. I want to talk.
Are you prepared to say most, Senator, or are you just going to go with many?
I'm going to stay with many. Let me say that as far as what happened at the NATO summit, very few Americans heard anything except the argument that went on about about funding. Now, I know the President believes, and I know you believe, and I believe, and I think most everyone believes that NATO is the most successful military alliance in the history of the world. And as you pointed out, it's certainly one of the pillars of our national security, and one that we need to support, and one that we need to work well. There are very few downsides of NATO, but there is one blemish. And the President has underscored that publicly and well. His predecessor attempted to do it. All their predecessors attempted to do it. All those of us that meet with the Europeans from time to time underscore it. And that is the funding, or the lack thereof, that the Europeans have done. Only 8 of the NATO nations are actually meeting the commitment of 2%. First of all, the President is to be commended for underscoring this as only he can do in his unique way, and actually getting them to start talking about it, and now finally starting to agree to that. But there were other things that were lost as far as that meeting is concerned, and I'd like you to talk about those things for a few minutes. Number one is on the deterrence side, the 430's commitment to increase NATO readiness and speed up the time it takes allies to assemble and deploy forces, and that's a huge step forward. The efforts to improve mobility and establish a process to enhance the speed at which NATO can make decisions, the fight against terrorism and increase in allied resilience against terrorist threats through a new framework to share biometric data is a major accomplishment. And finally, the opportunity for Macedonia to receive an invitation to join NATO and fulfill the promise from the Bucharest summit, that was a positive step for the alliance and for the Balkans. Could you comment on those very important steps forward that happened at this NATO summit?
Senator Risch, it was an incredibly productive NATO summit. From my conversations with Secretary General Stoltenberg, he said among the most productive that he had ever been part of. And he's been doing this a little while. You talked about the 430s, 30 squadrons, 30 battalions, and 30 naval combatants ready to go in 30 days. It's something NATO has not been able to do for quite some time. There's now a real commitment. We have to follow through to make sure that the implementation of that occurs. It would be a great thing to deter Russia if we can get those countries and our allies to get to that level. You talked about the increase in burden sharing. It seemed to get all the focus. It's certainly important that the Europeans are as committed to deterring Russia as the United States of America, and need to demonstrate that through their defense, not only dollars, but readiness as well. We've seen reports about the absence of German readiness. They need to truly be ready. The President also raised another issue about energy and energy security at the NATO summit. He talked about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the risk that creates to the alliance in the event that Russia should decide to use energy as a weapon to coerce either formally or informally Germany or other European countries. He raised it to the forefront, and frankly, there are European countries that understand that risk and support America and our position on that as well. And then finally, you talked a little bit about this, the NATO mission, its new role in fighting terrorism. I want to say thanks to so many of the European countries that have stepped forward. Even just this past few, I guess it's now 2 weeks since the NATO summit, over 1,000 additional commitments from allied NATO partners headed to assist us in Operation Resolute Support in Afghanistan. That's a great commitment, something that President Trump worked hard on at the summit, and really good outcomes for America.
Well, thank you so much. You're to be personally commended for those great successes, as is the President for leading in that regard. It's unfortunate that our friends and allies' feathers were ruffled a little bit just because we said they weren't paying their bills, but that's been going on for some time, and I think we're going to tolerate that, but they've got to step up, and I know you underscored that, and the President has certainly underscored that with them. I want to talk about Iran for just a moment. One of the big unreported stories as far as foreign relations is concerned is the issues and the difficulties that the Iranian people are having internally, financially and otherwise. And I know we're not in a classified setting, but there is some open reporting on these sources. And the regime that's there is struggling with this. Indeed, I think that's probably why they tried to poke the president the other day to try to take the heat off of the heat they're getting at home. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on internally, again, knowing that we're in an open setting?
Senator, there is enormous economic challenge inside of Iran today. It's an economic structure that simply doesn't work. When you foment that, when you're a country of that scale that foments terror through Lebanese Hezbollah, through Shia militias in Iraq, into Yemen, conducts assassination attempts in European countries, provides enormous support for Hafez Assad outside of Lebanese Hezbollah in Syria. That's expensive, and I think the Iranian people are beginning to see that that's not the model that they want, that the Iranian expansionism that the supreme leader Qasem Soleimani so favor is not what they're looking for. And I think you're beginning to see the economic impact combined with understandings inside of Iran of the kleptocracy that it is, leading to fundamental decisions that the Iranian people will ultimately have to make.
Do you agree with me that that acceleration of that understanding by the Iranian people has been very rapid over the last 6 months?
Yes, I think it's been going on longer than that, but yes, certainly.
It's been going on longer, but I'm talking about the acceleration.
Yes, Senator, I think that's a fair statement.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I could, just one interjection. I know the phrase "paying their bills" has been used, and we need to. Every NATO country needs to be contributing 2% to defense, and I've noticed those near the Russian border always do. But that's a misnomer, is it not? What we want them to do is contribute at least 2%. These NATO countries are not paying bills to the United States as sometimes is projected. Is that correct?
The shortfalls that the President identified really are in two buckets. There is a NATO common fund that is contributed to by every nation, and the United States is by far the largest contributor to that fund. And then there are monies that are paid for nations to raise their own militaries and to defend themselves. That's the 2% number to which we've been referring.
But it's not. It would be a mischaracterization to make it appear that they're not paying bills to the United States.
That's correct.
That's correct.
That's correct.
Senator Cardin.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. It's my understanding that the President is going to invite Mr. Putin to the United States to follow up on the understandings reached in Helsinki. Can you just briefly tell me what those understandings or agreements reached in Helsinki at the meeting?
Sure. I can certainly share with you the things that we've been tasked to follow up on by President Trump following that meeting. There's a handful. So there is an agreement to establish some business-to-business leadership exchanges that historically had been undertaken but had fallen away. These would be business leaders that would participate in this. I understand that this went on for years and years and was ceased a handful of years ago.
If we could do it briefly. I understand you want to give a complete thing, and I appreciate that.
It's what you asked for.
I understand that. Business to business. Next issue?
The President has asked us to look at reestablishing a Counterterrorism Council that was held at the level of the Deputy Secretary of State for many years, but had also ceased to happen. I think at this point, I think that makes sense.
Counterterrorism cooperation.
Counterterrorism. We are working to see in Syria what are the possibilities that can be achieved so that the now between 6 and 7 million externally displaced persons have the opportunity to return. We made clear this should happen through the political process in Geneva, but we are working to see if we can't get Russia to be more cooperative in terms of driving towards a political resolution there that would take down the violence levels and create some opportunity to begin a political resolution of the process in Syria.
Any discussions on sanctions? You said there was no easing of the sanctions?
No, Senator, no easing of the sanctions.
No,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Was there any discussion about Magnitsky? Because certain names associated with Magnitsky came out in Helsinki. Was there any discussion with the President on the Magnitsky sanctions?
No, there's been no change in U.S. policy with respect to Magnitsky. I think I know what you're referring to. Let me make clear. The United States will defend our team in the field and the team that's been in the field when it retires and leaves the field. We understand that Americans deserve the protection of the United States of America both during their time in service and thereafter.
Was there any agreements reached in regards to Ukraine?
No, Senator, that's an agree to disagree.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the U.S. policy hasn't changed, and you can see that, right?
And I understand.
$200 million since the Helsinki Summit provided to the Ukrainians. I think there was lots of concern that, and I saw it, I could find you all's quotes if you'd like me to go drag them out, concerns that President Trump would make a change in position with respect to Ukraine.
And you made that clear.
And there is none, and it is a policy that the previous administration refused to undertake. And so I hear comparative, it's important, Senator, comparison matters here because there's a narrative that is developed that somehow President Trump is weak on Russia, and when in fact the converse
let me just,
is true.
I heard you talk and brag about the number of sanctions.
Senator, these were just facts.
The facts is that the Congress passed the CAATSA statute that required sanctions to be imposed, and there are sanctions that are to be imposed under CAATSA that have not been imposed. And the facts are the administration has sought a waiver in regards to CAATSA in regards to the National Defense Authorization Act. So I just really want to point out, and we've had this from previous administrations, but not as much as we're hearing today, that what Congress is requiring you to do, all of a sudden you found religion and taking credit for it.
Senator,
but in reality, you haven't implemented on time the sanctions that have been passed by Congress.
Senator, first of all, that's not true. We've passed a number of sanctions under the CAATSA provisions, and it is also true, at least my best recollection of the Constitution, is the President signed that law as well. So I thank you for presenting that law. We appreciate it. We think it makes good sense. The President signed it as well. We have passed sanctions under that very law, and we have passed sanctions that Senator, you just have to know previous administrations didn't do.
Please read the President's comment when he signed the law, because it's very interesting, his comments. Let me move on to our policy in regards to nuclear proliferation in Iran and in North Korea, because I'm having a hard time understanding the comparison between these two countries. In North Korea, we have a country that has a nuclear weapon. The President has met with the leader of that country and has at least given a signal to some countries that, in fact, there may be relaxation of those. We're having problems with China today, as I understand. In Iran, we had a commitment for a short-term ending of their nuclear program. We were able to isolate Iran, getting the support of China, Russia, and Europe. And we were able to keep the temperature down in regards to their nuclear program. Now, by pulling out, we are now seeing we don't have any commitments on the short term if Iran walks away from the agreement, because they're already sanctioned now under the United States. We've been isolated, not Iran. And of course, Iran today was not pursuing a nuclear program. I agree with you, there may be long-term issues. So I'm having a hard time understanding our strategy in regards to preventing nuclear proliferation. Last point I would make, we had a hearing in this committee as to what is necessary to move forward with North Korea on giving up nuclear weapons. And the first thing they talked about, you have to have a full declaration of its nuclear arsenal and a timeline for dismantling. And I'm getting my information now from the South Koreans, not from the Americans. South Koreans have been reported to say that you asked for that information and you have not been able to get that information from Kim Jong-un or his representatives. So what have we gotten in North Korea, and why are we allowing North Korea to continue to have a nuclear weapon when the strategy is that as long as Iran is doing any types of enrichment, we're going to impose sanctions against them?
Senator, let me try. That was a long question. Let me try and unpack it a little bit. So let me give you the common theme. We want neither Iran nor North Korea to have the capacity to proliferate nuclear weapons, to enrich uranium, or build their own weapons program. That's the mission set. It draws them together. That sets the conditions for President Trump's understanding of how one achieves non-proliferation in the world. And that's the mission state we're undertaking in each of those two countries. They are in different places, and we are working on an approach in each place that we think increases the likelihood that we're able to successfully achieve that. A mission I know you share.
Yeah. Before turning to Senator Rubio's second interjection, I know mention was made of a waiver in the NDAA by Senator Mattis. Secretary Mattis, yes, actually. Yeah, he wouldn't want to be demoted to that level, I know. But I support that, and the purpose of that waiver was to allow countries that we're dealing with that we wish to buy American military equipment to be weaned off Russian equipment. They still had to buy parts to do so that we can more fully implement strategies with them, working with them to really push back against other countries. Is that correct?
Senator Corker, you captured it very well. It's Secretary Mattis and I both put forward this proposal, request to the Senate for these waivers. These are countries that have historic Russian weapon systems. If we deny them the capacity to have spare parts or to round out that process, then we're likely to drive them into the hands of the Russians. I don't think that was the aim of the sanctions themselves, and so we're working to effectuate the intent of the statute by seeking this waiver. It's pretty narrow.
Senator Rubio.
Would the chairman yield so I can clarify that?
Rubio may yield, but no, go ahead. Go ahead.
My point is that this is an issue we talked about in the development of the CATSA bill. There is absolutely no debate in this committee on the waiver request by the administration. I disagree with my distinguished chairman as to whether it was handled right. The country's had over a year to resolve that.
Yeah, it had become an acute issue, and it is a defense-related issue, and I'm glad that we've been able to resolve it in a manner that will allow these countries to wean off Russian equipment and begin buying ours. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Just watching to see if they reset my clock. It's like an NBA game. All right, well, let me start.
Reset the clock.
It's all right. We'll figure it out. I'll tell you when its time is up. Don't worry. When Vladimir Putin decided to interfere in our elections, you would agree he undertook a cost-benefit analysis. This is what the price would be for doing this. This is the benefit I think I would gain from it. And so where it leaves us is we have to do two things. We have to defend against potential interference, election systems and the like. But I think the other is we have to make sure that the price is higher than the benefit. And that actually points to one of the things you've already mentioned, and that is what we've already done. If you start to line up some of the things that we've done in response to that and other things, it's a pretty extensive list of, including things we've been asking for 4 years that have finally happened. The Javelin anti-tank missiles for Ukraine and Georgia, the support of NATO's new posture in Central and Eastern Europe, the variety of designations under both Ukraine and cyber-related executive orders that were from the Obama administration, sanctions under CATSA, and I know there's more to come for cybersecurity, several rounds of designation of individuals for weapons proliferation, terror, and transnational crime, export restrictions on entities that violated the INF Treaty. We closed consulates in San Francisco and in Seattle. We closed an annex in D.C. We closed the trade office in New York after the poison nerve gas attack in the UK. We expelled 60 other diplomats. All of those things happened under this administration. And these are pretty substantial, including the sanctions. But obviously, even that price is not high enough because the intelligence community continues to tell us that they are postured and are actively engaged in both attacking our democracy and posturing to do more of that in the future. So my question is along the lines of a piece of legislation that Senator Van Hollen and I and a group of other senators have jumped on board on, and it aims to do three things. One is sort of define interference. Okay, it's not just 5 Russian guys on Twitter. I mean, it's define it in terms of its meaning to our republic. Require the Director of National Intelligence to issue a report within 30 days of the election about whether or not interference occurred, and then put in statute a menu of very crippling sanctions. And the purpose of that would be so that Vladimir Putin knows before he makes this decision going to 18 or in the future, this is the price I will pay if I do this again. That's why it's called the Deter Act, to get on the front end of it. I don't ask you to opine on the bill, because I know you don't have it before you, but on the concept of building in deterrence on the front end, is that not an approach that we can take to hopefully deter him from doing this in the future by making him clearly understand how high the price would be in comparison to the benefit?
Senator, I completely agree with you that there is a cost-benefit calculation that's undertaken before the Russians act. So it follows necessarily that putting on notice with essentially a fail-safe, if you will, about things that will follow has the likelihood of being successful in raising the cost in terms of how he calculates risk associated with a wide range of actions.
Let me, you'll be asked plenty about Russia, so I don't want to undermine that, but I think the single biggest national security threat in the long term to the United States is China. I mean, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, we are in competition with a near-peer adversary, and it's not just military, it's economic, it's technological, it's geopolitical and the like. We've seen their impressive and massive military buildup, the quantum leaps they're making in technology. We see that the work they're undertaking to sort of destroy the U.S. world order and rebuild it to one more of their liking. We've seen the gains they've made in 5G alone. I mean, China Mobile will be the only company in the world that can build standalone 5G networks by 2020. And what's really outrageous is many advances are not the result of hard work and ingenuity. They're also the result of intellectual property theft, forced transfers, and the like. This is part of a tactic that they've been using for a while. The Chinese, and I think the South China Sea is a great example of it, they don't make these big sweeping changes. It's sort of a sustained, sort of slow and incremental, but more assertive demands each time, creating new normals along the way. And what they've done in the South China Sea is evidence of that. And the only ways that seem to work in response to their aggression are two things. The first is committed and sustained escalation across the relationship, meaning you don't carve out pieces of it. They do it that way. We have to do it that way. Our whole relationship, sustained and committed pressure. And the other is invoking the help of our foreign partners. And what I'm troubled by in regards to the administration posture on this is on the working with, invoking the help of our foreign partners has become complicated because we're currently engaged with trade disputes with the EU and Japan, Mexico, and Canada, which we should have teamed up with to confront them. And I understand trade is an issue that needs to be addressed, but I don't know why we didn't address China first together and then dealt with our allies second. And the other is the sustained and committed escalation across the entire relationship. And on that front, I'm puzzled by the decision the administration made on ZTE. And I know that was not a State Department decision, it was a Commerce one, because I agree that if the ZTE issue was simply a sanctions violation, the penalties imposed have been devastating. But ZTE is more than a sanctions threat to the United States. It is part of a broader telecommunication threat that the Chinese industries pose to the United States. And to threaten to shut them down and then pull back from it is not the sort of committed and sustained escalation across the entire relationship. The carving out of one company sends them the message that they can pick away at different parts of that relationship and undermine our willingness to sustain pressure on them to get a better equilibrium. So I don't know what the State Department's role was in that decision, but moving forward, what is our broader strategic approach to the threat that China poses? Because they don't seek parity, they seek to overtake us.
Senator, you have laid out what I think is the principal challenge for the United States over the coming years, maybe a decade. The issue of China, you talk about they've got a lot of folks and a big economy that puts them in the position to be a competitor to the United States in the way a country like Russia with an economy smaller than Italy's can't maintain over some period of time. And so we do need a broad, comprehensive response. And I think all of the West, not just the United States, was too slow in seeing this. Your point about how they turned up the heat slowly over time, I think that recognition is there. But I don't believe that the structures are in place today to respond to that in a way comprehensively. I was with our Australian partners yesterday at a meeting with Secretary Mattis, myself, and our Australian counterparts. They just passed a set of non-interference rules on China. They are getting up to speed in the same way that as you all took a look at CFIUS and FIRMA. We're getting up to speed. We are beginning to strike that comprehensive response versus China that I think will ultimately do what has historically happened, allow America to prevail.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you, Assistant Secretary Mitchell, and our charge in Turkey, Phil Kosnet, for your hard work and coordination on the efforts to release Pastor Brunson. As you pointed out, his move from prison to house arrest is a positive development. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do in terms of getting him back to the United States and also pressing the Turkish government to release the other Americans that they're holding. But it is a positive step, and thank you for that. I am concerned, Mr. Secretary, because it's been 1 week since, a little over a week, since the Helsinki meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And yet, other than the brief description you just gave us, we don't really know what was discussed in that meeting. We've heard DNI Coates, General Votel, and a number of State Department officials, including those who were present in last week's committee meeting on Iran, indicate that they still don't have a full understanding of what was discussed in that meeting. And we're seeing almost daily attempts by the Kremlin to take advantage of this opportunity as they release their own readouts of the conversation and broadcast news of various agreements that they say were reached in that meeting. So for me, that's why I'm so concerned and why I want to know exactly what was agreed to in that meeting. On Syria, President Trump said at his joint news conference that the two leaders discussed Syria at length. The Russian Ministry of Defense has indicated that the two leaders agreed to military cooperation in Syria. Did they do that?
Senator, the United States policy with respect to deconfliction with Russia has not changed. I will defer to the Department of Defense for details around that, but I can tell you that the policy that was in place with respect to their efforts to keep American pilots safe and keep American forces safe in Syria, that policy has not changed.
Do you know if they discussed that policy? If they discussed?
Senator, I do know that they discussed Syria. They absolutely discussed Syria. The focus of that discussion, and I think President Trump has shared this, was an effort to find a political resolution there and to get the displaced persons the opportunity to return to Syria. And I think the President's talked about one more item. So as the President shared it, I feel like I can as well. I think he also talked about America's continued commitment to ensure that Israel was secure from threats in Syria as well. And that topic was discussed by them as well. I think the President has previously shared that.
Do you know if there was any sort of downgrading of our U.S. presence in in Syria that was discussed?
Senator, there's been no change in U.S. policy with respect to our activities in Syria.
I understand, but that's not exactly the question.
Senator, it's what matters. It's what matters. What matters is what President Trump has directed us to do following his meeting with Vladimir Putin. It's what he has told his senior leadership team to do and how he wants us to deploy his foreign policy strategy.
And do you know if the frozen stabilization funds for Syria, the $200 million, was that ever discussed?
Senator, we are still working to review that policy. That's a State Department policy. We are still working to review it. The policy was the same the day before as it was the day after the President's meeting with Vladimir Putin.
And do you know if Iran was referenced in the context of Syria in their discussions?
Senator, again, it's not for me to disclose the contents of those conversations. I can tell you that each time I've spoken with President Trump, both before Helsinki Summit and after, Iran has been at a central point that we have focused on with respect to U.S. policy in Syria. I'm confident will remain so.
So In an interview, General Votel was asked about whether a deal had been made on Syria between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And he said, as you indicated, that he had received no instructions to change what he's doing. And he went further on to say, and I quote, "I would want to make sure that this isn't something that we stepped into lightly. I'm not recommending that, and that would be a pretty big step at this point." In response to his comments, the Russian Ministry of Defense put out a statement and also posted on social media, and again, I'm quoting the Russian media. They say, with his statements, General Votel not only discredited the official position of his supreme commander-in-chief, but also exacerbated the illegality under international law and U.S. law of the military presence of American servicemen in Syria. Can you tell me what our response has been to the Russian Ministry of Defense with respect to this statement?
Senator, my guess the response would be most appropriately from the Department of Defense and not from the Department of State, but I will humbly suggest to you that you ought to have more confidence in statements from General Votel than the Russian Ministry of Defense.
I do have more confidence in General Votel's statement. That's why I'm raising this question, because it seems to me that our response to the Russian Ministry of Defense ought to be very strong to say they have nothing to say about what our generals are doing in Syria. That's not their business, that's our business. And I would hope that that's a point that we make very strongly. I had the opportunity to visit Syria a little over 2 weeks ago, and I was very impressed with the work that our military has been doing in northeast Syria along the Turkish border. I was very impressed with the work of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And what I heard over and over again, both from the men and women who were serving and from the civilians, Syrian civilians on the ground, was, please don't leave us here to the fate of either Assad or the Russians or other forces that may come into that part of Syria. And please, just a little bit in help for reconstruction efforts would go a very long way. That part of Syria has stabilized. They are into reconstruction. They are sending back people who have been displaced to their homes. And it would be, I believe, a real terrible reversal of policy for us to leave those folks after what we've done and to turn them over to the Russians or to Assad's forces.
Senator, if I might, just so the facts are clear, the previous administration is the one that enabled Russia to have the capacity that they have in Syria today.
I'm not defending the previous administration, Mr. Secretary. I want this administration to continue doing what's working.
Its policy, this administration's policy. You're advocating for the continuation of this administration's policy. I think that's important for everyone to understand.
Senator Flake. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for your testimony. I wanted to commend the State Department, you in particular, for quick statements with regard to the nature of the conversation as it was between President Putin and President Trump regarding certain individuals like Mr. McFaul and others traveling to Russia to be interrogated by the Russians. The State Department came out and said that was inappropriate, despite the President's statement that it was an incredible offer. It took the White House a full 2 days or 3 days to contradict that statement that President Putin had made, but the State Department quickly said that that was inappropriate. And so, thank you for doing that.
Thanks, but Senator Flake, you give me a little bit too much credit. I'm doing my level best every day to implement the President's policies. And so that statement was from the United States President's State Department.
Okay, but the United States President said that it was an incredible offer. And so that's why I'm pointing out the difference and commending you. Please take it. With regard to what else was said during that meeting, I know you've given some indication of what was discussed. Let me just give a sense of how Russia is characterizing that meeting. And this is the problem with a private meeting like this. Many of us voiced strong concerns about having a private meeting like this with no readout officially for what happened. And here's what happens when a private meeting like that is held. Vladimir Putin's meeting with Donald Trump was, quote, better than super, Russia's top diplomat has said. The Leaders' Summit in Helsinki was fabulous. I think that was Lavrov who also said that. The remarks reported by Russian news agencies summed up the mood that Mr. Trump sided with the Kremlin over his own intelligence agency, so they're reporting that as well. Here's how one paper in Russia characterized it. Trump has failed to dominate Putin. Another tabloid said, a quiet, modest Trump has paled in comparison with Vladimir Putin. It's clear that Putin has outmaneuvered the U.S. president. That's the Russian media characterizing a meeting, and we have no readout to dispute any of it. All we have are the statements made by the president that they've made an incredible offer, for example, to have former U.S. diplomats shipped off to Russia to be interrogated. I'm glad to hear that one, there a little more time will be had before a new meeting takes place between the two principals. By the way, I think that it's good that our president and the Russian president speak and meet together. That's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing to meet in private with only an interpreter present with no readout, so that whatever is characterized is only characterized by the Russian side. So do you have any response or thoughts on that?
So I have a personal experience. I had a private conversation with North Koreans. We didn't issue a readout on the conversations quite intentionally, and the North Korean press chose to characterize it. We thought it was in America's best interest not to respond tit for tat about the nature of that conversation. We knew the truth. We knew what had taken place there. And, you know, it's the North Korean press, and so I assume that most reasonable people will discount it fairly significantly in the same way that one might the Russian press. These are important decisions about how much to disclose about private conversations were had, because everyone knows that you may have an expectation that you'll have another private conversation one day, and the absence of their belief that that private conversation has the capacity to remain in that space reduces the freedom to have those conversations. I know you've had this in your life too, Senator. I know you've had private conversations and you valued them. It was just you and someone else in that room, and it was important, and you didn't give anyone a readout from it because you wanted to have the chance to do that again, because you thought you could make real progress with that person.
Right. Let's talk about North Korea. You brought it up. You mentioned that you traveled to North Korea to continue on, as you put it, I guess, to follow up on commitments made in Singapore. Let's talk about those commitments for a minute. You mentioned that they have committed to denuclearization. They may have a different readout than we do on what that entails. But so far, they seem to be walking back any commitment, real commitment that was made there. What commitment, firm commitment, other than discussion of returning remains? I'm not discounting that, but in terms of denuclearization, what real commitments were made?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into the private commitments that have been shared. I don't think it's fair to characterize them walking back from commitments. Remember where we were, right? So it all depends what you draw as the projected line to say, are we in a better place or a worse place than we would have been absent the Singapore summit? One can draw a counterfactual reference. We'll never know where we might have been. But I will concede there is an awful long way to go. I'm not trying to oversell the accomplishments that we've had towards the path of denuclearization to date. There remains a great deal of work to do. It will be highly contested. That is, the modalities, the means, the timing of this will be things that I'm confident we'll be discussing for a period of time. There have been public reports, and I know the United States is tracking the disassembly of a missile engine test site. Something that Chairman Kim committed orally. It wasn't in the written agreement itself, but Chairman Kim committed in his conversation with President Trump to do. They're beginning to dismantle that. It has to do with their missile program. It's a good thing. Steps forward.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, for the time is out, something completely different. The country of Rwanda right now, and you may be familiar with this because of this week's focus on religious freedom,
yes,
has indicated a move toward severe restrictions on religious freedom, particularly from outside groups. What are the plans of the State Department to let them know that that is not in their own interest nor ours?
Senator, I share your concerns. I'll need to get back to you in terms of what actions we think we can take. I know we'll call it out. I know we'll label it for what it is. We do need to see what it is tragic, and anyway, I share your concerns, Senator. It's a huge challenge for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, just a couple of thoughts. I was very discouraged at the Helsinki summit when the President basically was offered a choice in some of the questions. Did he believe U.S. intel, or did he believe Vladimir Putin's protestations that he had engaged in hacking of the election? And he basically said, my own people have made a great case to me. Vladimir Putin has made a great case to me. I don't see why Russia would have done this. He came back and corrected it the next day in the United States, but at the end he said, I believe my intel community, but there's a lot of people out there, it could have been someone else. And then this dragged on for a couple of days. You know where I live. You know I have a lot of constituents who used to be your employees at the CIA. People come up to me all the time in Virginia and say, I'm with the IC, and they are very demoralized by this. They're very demoralized that when standing next to Vladimir Putin, the President's words were to suggest that he trusted Vladimir Putin over them. There was the suggestion when President Trump said it was an incredible offer about Ambassador McFaul, that he was also potentially willing to throw not just intel folks under the bus, but State Department diplomats under the bus. They live in Virginia, too. They feel the demoralization of your comments today that we're going to go to bat for current reformer. That's very, very helpful. But what I want to ask you about is our military and our military leadership. There was an article yesterday in the Washington Post. General Joseph F. Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as of Monday, Dunford still hadn't been briefed on Helsinki, even though it directly affects more than 1 million troops Dunford overseas. Do you know why there would have been no briefing of General Dunford about the discussions that took place at Helsinki?
Senator, you have to ask the Department of Defense or Chairman Dunford.
But you don't dispute that you have no knowledge that there was a briefing of General Dunford today about the Helsinki discussion, do you?
Senator, you just read me a piece from the Washington Post.
Yeah, but I'm asking your knowledge. Do you have any knowledge that the administration has shared discussions about U.S.-Russia military issues with the head of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff?
I've actually spoken with Chairman Dunford about it. I was with him yesterday in a series of meetings, and we had a chance to have a conversation about it, yes.
Okay,
about our plan, absolutely.
Okay, so yesterday may have been the first time he was briefed about it. I want to ask about
General. It's possible, yes.
I was going to ask about General Votel, the information that Senator Shaheen mentioned earlier. He expressed wariness about working with Russia, and the Russian Defense Ministry, this is an interesting statement. They went after General Votel, the head of CENTCOM, who oversees, as you know, U.S. military operations in the Middle East, including Syria. Quote, with his statements, General Votel not only discredited the official position of his Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Are you aware what the official position is that is being referenced in that statement?
You'd have to speak with the Russian Ministry of Defense to know what it was he was referring to.
But you can understand why we're concerned. If it's being reported in Russian press, as Secretary Flake and Senator Flake and Senator Shaheen said that they're talking about official positions that the President has outlined. As far as you know, General Votel's statements did not violate any official position in the United States, did they?
You seem to be giving a great deal of credit to the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Well,
for truthfulness.
Let me ask you about General Votel.
I might not share that same.
Let me ask you about General Votel. As far as you know,
great credit. I have great belief in his truthfulness.
So you do not believe that any of the statements that he's made, including those that I read, violate any official position in the United States, do you?
Senator, if you would, that's best approach to General Votel, the Department of Defense. I mean, we're now 3 orders removed. I'm sorry.
If I could introduce for the record, there's an interesting article in BuzzFeed News just recently today that just lists a whole series of headlines, and I think these are instructive, Mr. Chair. Trump's announcement that he will end U.S. Korea drills catches Pentagon off guard. Pentagon in Seoul surprised by Trump pledge to halt military exercises. Pentagon caught off guard by Space Force announcement. Trump signals withdrawal very soon of U.S. troops from Syria, surprising Pentagon and State Department. Pentagon caught by surprise by Trump's travel ban, pushes for some Iraqis to get special consideration. U.S. Joint Chiefs blindsided by Trump's transgender ban. Northcom caught off guard as Trump orders troops to U.S.-Mexico border. If I could introduce this for the record, Mr. Chair.
Without objection.
I worry about an administration that would take the Putin position over our intel community. I worry about the administration that would suggest it might be a great deal to consider handing over a former diplomat for questioning. I worry about an administration that is catching the Pentagon off guard, that is not consulting with General Dunford or briefing him for a week after a summit of this importance to our military. Mr. Secretary, you're aware of the NDAA prohibition, the current prohibition on Russian and U.S. joint military operations, are you not?
I'm aware of the existence of that provision, yes.
The provision prohibits any use of funds, it's in the NDAA, any use of funds to support joint Russia and U.S. military operations, and it also gives the Secretary of Defense the ability to undertake a national security waiver if he thinks that that's the right idea. Does the administration accept the legality and binding nature of that provision of law?
Senator, I think the DoD General Counsel would be the right person to ask about the intricacies of an NDAA provision that had to do with complex issues that span the gap between, I think, what you're getting between deconfliction and coordination. It's a complex undertaking, not a waiver that the State Department has the authority. But right. More broadly, yes, this administration follows the law, okay. If that's the question.
So sitting here today, you're not aware of a legal concern that the administration has about this NDA provision, are you?
I'm not aware of one.
And you're not aware that
we want to break out of this hearing now, but you can still follow Pompeo's remarks on our live blog at cbsnews.com/Pompeo. For now, we're going to take you to the White House, where President Trump is speaking after meeting with the European Commission.